What if one of the most recognizable voices in K-pop isn't impressive for the reason you think? Two vocal experts took a closer look at Jimin's voice, and instead of simply praising his famous tone, they started breaking down what was happening underneath it. The result was the kind of discovery that makes you stop the video and listen again. Because according to the analysis, Jimin's voice isn't simply about sounding beautiful. There is something much more complicated happening every time he sings. And once you understand it, you may never hear Jimin's vocals the same way again. Imagine the moment. A vocal recording begins. Jimin's voice enters softly. Not loudly. Not aggressively. Almost delicately. For a few seconds, everything sounds effortless. Then the experts begin listening. One of them pauses. The waveform is examined. The tone is replayed. A particular phrase is isolated. And suddenly, the conversation changes. They aren't talking about popularity anymore. They aren't talking about BTS. They aren't even talking about stage presence. They're talking about technique. And that is where this gets fascinating. Because Jimin's voice has always created a strange contradiction. It can sound incredibly soft, almost fragile, yet somehow remain emotionally powerful enough to fill an arena. How can a voice that seems so delicate carry that much emotional weight? That was the first mystery. And the answer begins with something most casual listeners probably never notice. Jimin doesn't always need to overpower a note to make you feel it. That distinction matters. A singer can produce a huge sound and still leave you emotionally untouched. Another singer can barely raise their volume, and somehow make an entire room go silent. Jimin often operates in that second space. And when the experts started examining his singing more closely, they began focusing on exactly why that happens. It starts with his tone. Jimin has a naturally distinctive vocal color. You could hear a BTS song playing from another room, catch only a few seconds of a vocal line, and sometimes recognize him almost immediately. That recognizability is incredibly valuable for an artist. But distinctive doesn't automatically mean technically exceptional. So the real question was, what happens when you remove the fame, the choreography, the production, the visual performance, and simply examine the voice? That's where the analysis becomes much more interesting. Because once the voice is isolated, another characteristic becomes impossible to ignore. Jimin's sound often carries a noticeable brightness. But underneath that brightness is a softer, almost airy quality. That combination creates an unusual emotional effect. The voice can feel close to your ear while simultaneously sounding distant. Intimate. Yet cinematic. Gentle. Yet intense. And that contradiction is one reason his vocal moments can hit listeners so hard. But there was another layer. And this is where things get even more interesting. The experts weren't simply listening to whether Jimin could reach a note. They were paying attention to what happened before the note. The transition. The preparation. The movement between different parts of his range. Because sometimes the most impressive part of singing isn't the note itself. It's how the singer arrives there. Think about a staircase. Anyone can point to the top step and say, "Look how high that is." But a trained listener pays attention to every step leading upward. Was the movement smooth? Did the pressure suddenly increase? Did the sound tighten? Did the singer lose control? Or did the voice transform naturally? And when Jimin moves through certain passages, that transition becomes part of the emotional story. The listener doesn't consciously analyze it. They simply feel something happening. And that may be one of the biggest reasons his vocals can sound so emotionally immediate. But then came the detail that really caught attention. The experts began discussing Jimin's use of vocal texture. And suddenly, that soft quality people associate with his singing looked completely different. Because breathiness can be beautiful. But uncontrolled breathiness can also make a voice unstable, inefficient, or difficult to sustain. The difference is enormous. So when a singer uses an airy quality intentionally, the real skill is knowing how much air to use and when to stop using it. Too much? The sound disappears. Too little? The emotional color changes. But in carefully controlled moments, that breathiness can make a phrase sound almost painfully intimate. And Jimin has repeatedly used that emotional color in ways that make listeners lean closer. It's almost like the voice is whispering a secret in the middle of a stadium. And somehow, you feel like it was meant specifically for you. That is not simply volume. That is communication. But there was still a question hanging in the air. If Jimin's voice is so recognizable because of its color, what happens when the music demands power? Does the delicate quality disappear? Does he have to sacrifice his signature tone to become louder? This is where the analysis takes another turn. Because power in singing is often misunderstood. People hear a loud note and assume the singer is using more force. But professional singing is much more complicated. True vocal power can involve resonance, coordination, breath management, vowel shaping, and efficient vocal fold function. In other words, screaming louder isn't necessarily singing stronger. And that distinction becomes important when examining Jimin. There are moments when his voice moves from a softer texture into a more intense sound. Listen carefully. The emotional intensity rises. The vocal color changes. But the identity of the voice remains. That is difficult. Because if you push too hard, the voice can lose its natural character. It can become strained. It can sound forced. Yet when the transition works, the listener experiences something almost cinematic. The voice seems to expand without completely losing its personality. And that is exactly the kind of detail trained listeners notice. But now we have to talk about something even more important. Emotion. Because technical analysis can tell us how a singer produces sound. It cannot completely explain why one performance makes millions of people feel something. That part is more mysterious. And Jimin's singing has always been strongly connected to emotional expression. He doesn't simply sing words. He often changes the emotional weight of a phrase through tiny adjustments. A little more breath. A slight change in intensity. A softer ending. A different attack. A subtle shift in pronunciation. These details may seem microscopic. But together, they change the emotional temperature of a performance. And this is where the second expert's perspective becomes particularly interesting. Instead of focusing only on whether Jimin's voice is beautiful, the analysis starts asking a more difficult question. Why does his voice make certain emotions feel so immediate? Think about sadness. A singer can sing a sad lyric perfectly. Every note can be technically correct. But if the delivery feels emotionally distant, the audience may not connect. Jimin often approaches emotional material differently. There can be vulnerability in the sound itself. Not necessarily because the singer is actually experiencing the emotion in that exact moment, but because the vocal delivery creates the perception of vulnerability. And listeners respond to that. They hear something human. Something imperfect. Something fragile. And suddenly, the lyric feels heavier. But here comes another twist. That emotional vulnerability can actually become a strength. Because Jimin's voice doesn't always need to sound enormous to feel important. Sometimes the smaller the sound becomes, the more attention it demands. Think about a movie theater. When the soundtrack becomes huge, you feel overwhelmed. But when everything suddenly becomes quiet and one character whispers something important, everyone leans forward. Silence can create tension. Softness can create focus. And in singing, restraint can sometimes be more powerful than force. That is part of what makes Jimin's softer moments so memorable. But if that were the entire secret, this wouldn't be nearly as fascinating. Because the experts noticed something else. His voice doesn't exist in isolation. Jimin is a performer. That means his singing is connected to movement, breathing, choreography, facial expression, timing, and emotional storytelling. Now imagine trying to sing a technically demanding phrase while simultaneously performing intense choreography. Your body is moving. Your heart rate is elevated. Your breathing pattern changes. Your muscles are working. And yet you still have to find the right pitch, shape the vowels, maintain timing, and communicate emotion. That is a completely different challenge from singing in a quiet studio. And this is one reason live performance matters so much when evaluating an artist. A studio recording can be polished. A live stage reveals how the instrument behaves under pressure. And Jimin has performed some of BTS's most demanding material under exactly those conditions. That doesn't mean every performance is perfect. No human singer is perfect. And that's important. The goal of a serious vocal analysis shouldn't be to pretend an artist has no limitations. It should be to understand the strengths, challenges, choices, and unique characteristics that make the voice what it is. And when you look at Jimin through that lens, the picture becomes much more nuanced. His voice has a particular identity. His emotional delivery is distinctive. His upper range color can be striking. His breathier textures create intimacy. And his ability to move between softness and intensity gives his performances dramatic contrast. But there is still one question. What exactly is the rare quality these experts are reacting to? Is it his range? His tone? His emotional delivery? His ability to transition between registers? Or is it the combination? That is where the answer becomes much more satisfying. Because rare doesn't always mean one impossible feature. Sometimes rarity comes from the combination of several characteristics that don't usually appear together. Imagine finding someone with speed, precision, flexibility, and endurance. Each quality is impressive. But finding all four in one person is much less common. The same principle can apply to a singer. A beautiful tone is one thing. Strong technique is another. Emotional communication is another. Distinctive vocal identity is another. Stage performance is another. But when several of those characteristics interact, the result can become unmistakable. And that is what makes Jimin so fascinating to analyze. You can debate individual technical choices. You can debate which songs best showcase his voice. You can debate whether one performance is stronger than another. But one thing is difficult to deny. You know when you hear Jimin. And that matters enormously in music. Because in an industry filled with extraordinary voices, identity is everything. A technically competent singer can sound good. A recognizable singer can become memorable. But an artist whose voice instantly creates an emotional atmosphere? That is different. And Jimin has built much of his vocal identity around that atmosphere. Now think back to the beginning. 2 vocal experts. 1 voice. 1 analysis. And a question that seemed simple. What makes Jimin's singing different? The deeper they go, the less satisfying a simple answer becomes. It isn't just the high notes. It isn't just the softness. It isn't just the breathiness. It isn't simply vocal range. It isn't simply technique. It is the interaction between these elements. And then comes perhaps the most important realization. The thing listeners often describe as Jimin's emotional voice is not created by emotion alone. There is technique underneath the emotion. There is control underneath the softness. There is intention underneath the vulnerability. And there is performance underneath the intimacy. That is why the same phrase can sound completely different depending on how he approaches it. The note itself may be identical, but the emotional meaning changes. And that is the difference between simply producing sound and communicating through sound. Now imagine being in an arena. Thousands of lights. Thousands of voices. Bass vibrating through the floor. The stage is enormous. Jimin steps forward. The crowd is screaming. Then the music drops. For a fraction of a second, everything becomes quieter. And his voice enters. Not with a roar. With a feeling. That contrast is powerful. Because the audience has just experienced something enormous. And suddenly they receive something intimate. The stadium feels smaller. The distance disappears. For a moment, it feels like the singer is standing right in front of you. That emotional illusion is one of the great powers of vocal performance. And Jimin knows how to use it. But there is something else fans often overlook. Vocal color can change with emotion. A phrase sung with confidence can sound completely different from the same phrase sung with vulnerability. Jimin frequently uses those changes as part of his interpretation. That means the voice becomes another acting tool. Not just pitch. Not just rhythm. Character. Mood. Story. And that is why some of his vocal moments remain memorable long after the song ends. You remember how they made you feel. Not necessarily every technical detail. You remember the atmosphere. The tension. The softness. The sudden lift. The emotional release. And perhaps that is the most powerful takeaway from the experts' analysis. They didn't simply uncover a hidden trick. They revealed why Jimin's voice can feel so recognizable and emotionally effective. There is something fascinating about a singer who can make vulnerability sound beautiful without making it feel weak. That is a difficult balance. Too much softness, and the performance loses energy. Too much force, and the emotional intimacy disappears. But when the balance works, that is when the voice becomes unforgettable. And suddenly, the word rare starts to make sense. Not because Jimin possesses some magical vocal ability that no other singer has. There are countless extraordinary vocalists around the world. Rather, his uniqueness comes from the particular combination of vocal color, emotional expression, stylistic choices, and performance identity that has become unmistakably his own. That is something you cannot manufacture overnight. You can train technique. You can develop range. You can strengthen breath control. But vocal identity develops through years of singing, performing, experimenting, failing, adjusting, and discovering what makes your voice yours. And that journey is written into the sound. Which brings us to the final question. Why did two experts seem so fascinated when examining Jimin's voice? Because when you stop looking at him simply as a global superstar and start listening to him as a vocalist, another picture emerges. You begin hearing the details. The transitions. The texture. The restraint. The emotional choices. The moments where softness becomes strength. And the moments where a seemingly simple phrase carries far more weight than expected. Maybe that is the real secret. Jimin doesn't need every moment to sound enormous. He needs the right moment to feel enormous. And when that moment arrives, the voice does something remarkable. It makes people stop, listen, and feel. That is the part no waveform can fully explain. A machine can measure frequency. A program can visualize pitch. An expert can discuss resonance, breath management, registers, articulation, and vocal coordination. But the final reaction belongs to the listener. That sudden feeling in your chest. That moment when a lyric suddenly sounds personal. That strange sensation when a voice seems to reach through a recording and meet you where you are. That is why vocal analysis can only take us so far. Because singing is not just physics. It is communication. And Jimin's greatest strength may be the way he turns technical elements into emotional experiences. So the next time you hear him sing, don't just listen to the high note. Listen to what happens before it. Listen to the breath. Listen to the transition. Listen to the texture. Listen to how the vowel changes. Listen to how the intensity rises, or deliberately doesn't. And most importantly, listen to how the emotion changes the sound. Because once you start hearing those details, the performance becomes an entirely different experience. You realize that what sounded effortless may actually contain years of development. What sounded fragile may contain tremendous control. And what sounded simple may have been carefully shaped to make you feel something. That is the paradox of Jimin's voice. The more closely you examine it, the less simple it becomes. And perhaps that is exactly why two vocal experts could begin with a technical analysis and end up genuinely fascinated. Because sometimes the most extraordinary voices aren't the ones that simply prove how powerful they are. They are the ones that make you forget you're listening to technique at all. They make you feel like you're hearing a human emotion in its purest form. And when Jimin's voice reaches that space, everything else fades away. The lights. The choreography. The stage. The cameras. Even the name BTS. For a few seconds, there is only a voice. And that voice is enough. So now I want to know what you hear. When Jimin sings, what is the first thing that grabs you? His tone? His emotional delivery? His higher notes? That breathy texture? Or the way he can make a simple line feel intensely personal? Tell me in the comments. Because sometimes the most interesting part of a vocal analysis isn't what the expert discovers. It's what millions of listeners feel. And if this analysis made you hear Jimin's voice differently, stay with us for the next one, because there may be even more hidden details inside those performances that most people hear without ever realizing they're there. And honestly, once you start listening for them, you may never hear Jimin the same way again.